So I'm Ely Sandler. I teach along with my colleague Dan Schrag at the Harvard Kennedy School, a new course that we started this year called Financing the Clean Energy Transition. So basically the idea is to say that climate finance has a particular problem, unlike a lot of other types of public policy, where, as I'm going to show in my presentation, if I get to share my screen, is that we need private capital. And so the course we teach at Harvard together, here we are, is about how we can use public policy to get more private investment in climate change, in adaptation and mitigation and loss and damage. So I'm going to run through a couple slides, but really these are just a springboard to talk about some of both the topics we discuss in our class. It's one of the largest classes at the Harvard Kennedy School, about 100 students. And then also my background is I worked for about 10 years at Morgan Stanley, helping run the sustainable finance business. And then now I work in climate finance. So what is it that public policy can do to increase the numbers I'm about to show you? So climate finance needs vastly outpace climate finance flows and commitments. In other words, the amount of money that scientific modeling suggests we need to invest in the economy to reach the targets we've set at places like Paris, that vastly exceeds what we are seeing today. So this is kind of my own compilation of the different climate finance flows we see. We have about $1.3 trillion invested in climate change mitigation. That means anything that reduces emissions. Principally, that's renewable energy generation. So basically paying for utility scale renewable energy. It's also things like transmission, it's electric vehicles, it's anything that can replace a hydrocarbon with a renewable energy source. We have under $100 billion invested in adaptation. And we have a tiny, tiny commitment to the loss and damage fund announced at COP last year. This is what is currently happening. These are the flows we currently see in the world. And then this is what, and we're going to talk a little bit about where these numbers came from. This is what we maybe want to get to. Mitigation, if we go by the pledges made on cross-border flows at places like COP15, the Paris Agreement, and we go on the best modeling from, you can see the sources of this slide, the Climate Policy Initiative or the Grantham Institute. We want about $6 trillion total of investment by 2030. People think about $5.5 trillion of that needs to be in mitigation, maybe $400 billion in adaptation, and maybe $300 billion in the loss and damage fund. I'm going to be talking about mitigation for reasons I'll get to. And it's basically that we think that private capital can be mobilized in climate change mitigation. If you think about what you're actually funding, it's probably an extremely productive asset. It's something that generates electricity that could be used for powering someone's home. People will pay for that. It's an electric vehicle. People will pay for that. Adaptation is a little bit harder. The classic adaptation project is a seawall. Maybe you can structure something interesting based on insurance, but essentially that's an asset that doesn't produce revenue. The same with, let's say, changing the way we build hospitals or the way we build houses. It's just an expense. It's not a productive investment. So it's very, very hard to get private capital in there. So what I'm going to focus on is policies to help increase financing and mitigation. And what I'm hoping is, this is a very short presentation, and we spend a whole course doing this at Harvard. What I'm hoping is that there's some familiarity by the end of this kind of 20 minutes on what are the numbers and what are the things we can do to reach them. So one important thing before we dive into the figures is that climate change mitigation, it's very important to remember, it basically means investment in energy. So we're basically trying to increase energy usage, but do it in ways that don't emit CO2. So often in discussions of climate change, we think about a trade-off between energy policy and climate policy because we're trying to limit hydrocarbons. And the way I want people to think about climate change mitigation is to say, actually, if you're interested in, let's say, development finance or interested in industrial policy, these are essentially the same thing. This $5.5 trillion that we're going to talk about is basically just investments in energy, which is an investment in development. I just went for some projects we're working on to Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. And we're trying to build their large hydropower plants, transmission lines, and then electricity distribution, basically hooking households up to the grid. And from a climate change mitigation point of view, we're trying to get people to, instead of cooking with charcoal, which is bad for human health, and also reduces emissions because you're burning charcoal, we're trying to hook them up to zero emissions electricity. Now, that counts as climate change mitigation. There's fewer emissions from the charcoal. But actually, that's very, very similar to development policy. So let's put some of these numbers in context. This is the history of the amount we've invested in total in kind of energy transition stuff, about $1.5 trillion per year. That's a combination of mitigation, adaptation, and whatever loss and damage there is. And as I said, the estimate, and this comes from a variety of sources, this is led by something called the Songway and Stern report, is about $6 trillion. And one of the things, just as an example, in the first class we teach at Harvard, we say to people, what kind of climate policy interests you? And one of the things that often comes up is voluntary carbon markets. And so this is because people interested in working with them, it seems almost like free money. Someone will pay you to reduce emissions, pay you to build energy, but also because they've got a lot of criticism. And I think it's important to keep a sense of scale. So for example, when we're thinking about different public policies, how big of a opportunity are carbon offsets? And on the screen, what you see is out of this 1.5 trillion, about 1.2 billion today is invested via carbon offsets. And of the 6 trillion we need to get to, a report from BCG, the consultancy in 2023, they said that they think carbon offsets will reach about $5 billion of investment by 2030. And in that report, they called the carbon markets thriving. And so this is not to cast aspersions on their analysis, but if the aspiration of the carbon market is $5 billion and we're trying to reach 6 trillion, this is not the key tool. The key tool is much, much, much broader in terms of public policy, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so. So where does the investment come from? It's not carbon offsets, it's private investment. It's really, really standard types of public policy and private policy that increase investment. So at the moment, if you were to kind of go into the figures and just look at the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that this is basically led by national governments and international development. So this is governments in the United States. This would be things like investing in the transmission line. And this is the IRA and spending on energy. International development is principally led by the World Bank. It's basically public coffers taking money and investing in the energy transition, principally in generation. There's a little bit of households, corporations in the financial system. And at the moment, it's about 35% of total climate investment in the world, but that varies hugely. So what these numbers hide is that about a third, maybe almost half of investment in the energy transition at the moment is private. But in Africa, it's less than 5%, and in America, it's more than 90%. So actually, we're doing very, very well in the United States in terms of crowding in private capital, which means you can get to just much, much larger sums of investment. But the problem is that we're not doing that in places like Africa and Southeast Asia, and that is actually where we need the investment. So some investment is needed in the United States to transform the economy. But the thing holding back the US, and we're going to get there, is not really capital, it's things like permitting. It's not a lack of money that's being willing to be invested. It's not that private investors aren't willing to put money into the United States. It's that there's kind of other issues that aren't in the remit of this section. So where do we need to get to? We want to imagine that by 2030, the majority of investment in climate change is in the private sector. I would love to have time to go into how kind of each of these works. Household is obviously purchasing goods. This is principally driven by electric vehicles. Corporations is kind of companies investing in decarbonizing their supply chain. Think green steel, this kind of thing. And then the financial system is basically intermediating, giving loans. So what's going wrong? At the moment, lending to the global south is negative. This means that they're actually paying out more money in debt repayment and interest repayment than is going in new loans. In other words, the way to think of this is kind of Africa as a whole, and we're going to talk about a couple of specific examples, is a net contributor to the budget, to the kind of, the capital account surplus of the West. I'll get to what that means in a second, but if we think about the previous slide, we need to scale up investment. Actually, at the moment, investment in where we need the new energy is going down. What is that and why? So first of all, there's been a massive contraction in Chinese lending. That's actually the reason you see the decline. There's not really a decline in lending from private creditors or truly private creditors or from the World Bank. It's basically because Chinese loans to Africa have gone to essentially zero due to problems with the Chinese economy that we're not going to get into here. But what is the effect of that? And there's kind of two ways you can think about what people often call the climate finance gap. So you remember I showed this bar of 1.5 trillion and we need to get to 6. In some ways, that's a gap of $4.5 trillion. We're at 1.5 trillion, we need to get to 6. But actually, the world doesn't have a lack of money. It's not that we need to look behind the sofa and find $4.5 trillion. The climate finance gap, in my mind, should not actually be expressed in terms of a volume of capital, but in terms of a cost of capital. Because there is always money available It just depends how much you have to pay for it. It depends what return on equity is demanded. It depends what is the interest rate on the loan you might get, and do you have the ability to pay. So what I'm going to spend basically the rest of my time talking about is cost of capital. And the title of the talk is policies to increase investment in climate finance. But for me, actually, given, as we've seen, what we need for climate finance is private investment. And as I'm going to get to, the thing holding back private investment is the cost of capital. This is really where we should be putting our focus in terms of policy. So all projects have a cost of capital. Again, I would love to go into this more and what we do in our class. Really, really simple. The cost of capital is how much you have to pay to borrow money. So let's say that you're investing in a house, your cost of capital would be your mortgage rate. If you're a government, your cost of capital is probably your government bond, the borrowing rate. If you're building a solar farm, it's kind of the weighted average cost of capital of all the different instruments, from the equity investments from your shareholders to the kind of the bank loans you take out. And cost of capital is comprised of a lot of different building blocks. So you have a risk-free rate, which is normally based on the United States, and it's saying that like this is kind of the cheapest you could ever borrow money, hovering around 4%. You add sovereign risk, which is basically the country. So how risky is the country you're operating in? In the US, very, very low. No sovereign risk above the risk-free rate because it's America. In India, it's higher. In Nigeria, it's even higher. Currency risk. What happens if your currency depreciates and you can't pay it back? And then project risk, specific things to, let's say, a new technology. And the problem is that in a lot of emerging markets, you get to a cost of capital that looks like, this is an example from Kenya, 19%. And a fundamental principle of kind of business, economic finance is that economic value exists in the difference between how much you have to pay to borrow and then what return you can generate. So basically, if you could think of your cost of capital here, any return you get above your cost of capital is profit. But if you're borrowing at 19% and your project returns 17% or 15%, you've just lost money. And so what this does is it means that any project in developing countries, climate projects, or any other project, because they have such a high cost of capital, the bar to make the investment viable for the private sector just gets higher and higher and higher, in part because they have to pay out more money to kind of servicing debt, and in part because what people sometimes call the no-go threshold is so high. You have to be making more than 19% in Kenya on your project to be creating any economic value being the difference between cost of capital and the return. And unfortunately, there just aren't projects in Kenya, really, that are stable and secure and renewable that return that level of investment. If you compare this to the United States, let's say you can borrow at 4%, the body of projects you can invest in is so much higher. And that's why I said that in the US, the thing holding back investment is not really cost of capital, not a lack of private sector investment, it's things like permitting. People can't put money in even if they want to. Connections to the grid, this kind of thing. So what does this mean? Well, if we look at the 10-year government bonds in a whole bunch of different countries, you'll see just how high the cost of capital is. Now, remember, this is just the first kind of couple building blocks. This is the risk-free rate plus the sovereign risk. There's also currency risk, because these are US dollar. There's also project risk. This is the cheapest you can borrow in Pakistan, the cheapest you can borrow in Egypt, the cheapest you can borrow in Angola. The red color means that they're kind of negotiating a restructuring with the IMF. And what you'll see is that in Pakistan, the risk-free rate essentially is above 15%, close to 20. Same in Egypt, same in Angola. And so this just really drives up the unviability of any private sector projects. One other interesting thing to note that, again, is kind of a side topic that we deal with a little bit more economicsy in the class is the difference between 2020 and 2024 just in the risk-free rate, because the Fed tightened interest rates in the United States basically from 2022. The base of that cost of capital has doubled from about 2% to 4.5%. And so projects in general are just getting harder to finance because the threshold, the go-no-go for what you need is so much higher. This has a lot of impacts, and we're going to talk about renewable energy in a second. But I just want to take a step back for one slide and say that this is actually a much wider problem than climate finance. This is a huge problem for governments in general. Climate finance, to some extent, is discretionary spending. You could be investing in seawall if adaptation or renewable energy if you have this policy goal of decarbonizing your economy. But you also have things like healthcare, you have things like urban development. And if you look at what cost of capital does to government budgets, it's to me quite shocking. So more than 50% of Pakistan's government budget, you can see this on the slide, is paid out as interest payments. So more than half of the government budget of what Pakistan collects will need to go to pay back its creditors. Same in Egypt. And what this actually means is that there's not enough money to kind of pay government salaries, let alone create discretionary investments and close in on that gap of $4.5 trillion to get to six. And this is basically why I said that cost of capital is really the way I would think about climate finance gap, because there are plenty of people right now that will be willing to lend to Pakistan or whatever, incredibly high interest rate it is, 20%, but nothing is economically viable. And so while, yes, the output of what we need is $4.5 trillion more of investment, what we need to target is not directly the investment, it's lowering the cost of capital. And this is particularly a problem for renewable energy, and this is my last slide before I kind of talk about policies, because if you look at the financing structure of how kind of dirty fossil fuel industries get funded versus renewables, renewable projects are much more capital intensive. This means that basically you invest loads of money now, you borrow, you build a very, very expensive nuclear facility, transmission line, EV factory, and then you probably have very low OPEX. You're not paying for fuel, OPEX being operating expenses. And so the kind of the temporal bit, the time when you spend money is really, really weighted towards the front. You can see this on the chart. CapEx, capital expenditure, kind of upfront cost for a fossil fuel project on average. This comes in at 8%. The vast majority of costs are OPEX. And the OPEX costs, paying for fuel, they're paid out of your revenue. So you get the fuel, you make the power, you sell the power, you set to buy the fuel. The problem is that because there are such high CapEx costs for renewable projects, even though they have very small OPEX, they're very, very sensitive to financing costs, because the amount you're having to pay to borrow to get that CapEx investment is gone up. And so that's my last slide, to say that there's this problem generally about cost of capital and countries doing investments in general. And even if they had all the will in the world and investors wanted to lend to them at the market rate, if the cost of capital is too high, it's a problem because the private sector won't get involved, and we know the private sector is necessary for the energy transition. This is particularly a problem, indeed, for the energy transition. Actually, it means that when financing rates are high, you have a natural preference as an investor or a government to work in more pollutive industries. The final thing then is, what do we do about this? And the answer is actually the same types of policy interventions that we've been doing for 50 years. Some successful, some unsuccessful. This is things like blended finance, putting up guarantees, cheap loans, cheap equity investments. We can conceptualize things like carbon credits, not necessarily as kind of that small, tiny line I showed in the first slide of revenue, but maybe a way to access upfront financing. It's something I'm working on through something called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Other things as well. So you can use the tax system to give tax rebates to increase returns and decrease cost of capital. The policies, actually, generally speaking, are kind of known. Like we know how to fund things. What we have to think about is that the energy transition and the climate finance gap is not a gap in terms of like finding a stack of dollars. What it is making sure that there is money available to be borrowed for investment in renewables and transmission and everything we need. And there's a great body of literature on it. And if any of you are Harvard students, I would encourage you to take our class next year. So I think with that, I'm out of time.